Putin has sort of, stood aside all the people he's been supporting, like Assad and like Maduro in Venezuela. He has done the square root of absolutely nothing to help them when the Americans have flexed their muscles. And one doesn't anticipate they'll do much to help Iran either. But the wider issues that particularly Iran, that has bought so much Russian kit that is now seen to be, pretty second rate when it comes to American kit, is very significant indeed. So I think everybody is on tenterhooks at the moment. And really, we are yet to see what Trump will proclaim today and the rest of this week.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former British Army Colonel. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Yesterday, President Trump told Iranian demonstrators on Truth Social that help is on the way. He also said that he would take very strong action if Iran executed protesters. And today it's been reported that US personnel at its largest military base in the Middle East has been advised to leave. Is this a sign that Trump is preparing to strike Iran?
Well, it's a hugely complex situation at the moment. And certainly what's happening in Iran has grabbed the attention of the world and President Trump. We understand, around 3,000 protesters have now been killed, a lot of them shot by Iranian police and secret police and all the rest of it. And that has become very clear. I think, from President Trump's perspective, he is now really seen two autocratic dictators removed from power, either directly or indirectly by his acts. First of all, there was President Assad in Syria, and of course, President Maduro only a few weeks ago, very much at the behest of Trump. So one gets the impression that Trump is also viewing possibly shortening the reign of Ayatollah Khamenei, who has been ruling this autocratic state. And it's very clear that Trump has been, very active in the Middle East with his very close allies in Israel, have attacked Iran a number of times. And it's pretty clear that a lot of the proxies that Iran has, like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, these jihadi terrorists, if you like, have destabilized the Middle East. And I'm sure President Trump thinks that if he can eradicate that threat, then the Middle East will once again be more stable. So I think against that background and the fact that President Trump has said that he's going to do something if any more of the protesters are executed, and a number in particular, Ephraim Soltani, who is a 26-year-old, only arrested a few days ago, apparently is going to be executed today, and his parents have appealed directly to the US president. So on that basis, and then when you look at removal of some US military personnel from the Middle East, particularly from Al Udeid, which is the main US air base in Qatar, the Americans did something similar before the very significant strike that the Americans did against the nuclear facilities in Iran last year. So the mood music and what is happening is very much pointing towards some US military action against Iran, and potentially quite soon.
Do you think that the US strikes on Iran last year, where they targeted the Iranian nuclear facilities, do you think that gives us some sort of indication of what the US might potentially target if they were to strike Iran? And how do you expect the US to carry that out too?
Well, I think it is a good indicator. I think firstly, the Americans now know, or they knew when they attacked last year, that they can do this pretty much with impunity. I think it was a hugely significant event because actually all the Iranian air defense is Russian. and the Russian air defense has seemed to be inadequate against American sort of fourth generation stealth fighters and cruise missiles. So it's clear that if Trump wants to attack uh, Iranian military bases, maybe Iranian leadership, and further against nuclear facilities, they can pretty much do it without concern that their fighters or anything else is going to be knocked down by Iran. And I think Iran is pretty clear that that's the case too. Iran is much diminished since last year because not only did the US attack these facilities in Iran, the Israelis have pretty much destroyed Hezbollah, who are the main agents, proxies, if you like, of Iran, doing so much damage across the Middle East. The Houthis down in Yemen, in the southern of the Arabian Peninsula, have been hit too, and Hamas are pretty much neutralized in Gaza. So I think, against all that sort of background, the Americans will be pretty confident that they can pretty much do as they please. And I think we talked about sort of regime change or certainly leadership change earlier on, and also anything that really happens in Iran has a direct impact on Russia as well. And I think it's fascinating is probably the wrong word, but Putin has sort of stood aside all the people he's been supporting, like Assad and like Maduro in Venezuela. He has done the square root of absolutely nothing to help them when the Americans have flexed their muscles, and one doesn't anticipate they'll do much to help Iran either. But the wider issues that particularly Iran, that has bought so much Russian kit that is now seen to be pretty second rate when it comes to American kit, is very significant indeed. So I think everybody is on tenterhooks at the moment, and really, we are yet to see what Trump will proclaim today and the rest of this week.
It's been reported that a number of Middle Eastern governments have tried to persuade the US to not go to war with Iran over fears of unprecedented consequences. We're also hearing reports that Israeli and Arab officials have told the Trump administration they don't believe that the Iranian regime has been weakened to a point at which US strikes could topple it completely. Do you think there's a question there that for example, if the US was to target Iranian nuclear facilities, while it more aligns with US security objectives, does it achieve that other objective there of trying to establish longer term stability within Iran?
I mean, that is really the $1 million question. The fact that particularly the Saudis are really pushing back on this and trying to tell the Americans, trying to tell Trump that this is not the way forward, and this is likely to destabilize the Middle East. But then on the other side, you've got the Qataris, where, of course, main US bases and where these probably attacks will be launched from, very, very much supporting it. I think the other Gulf states know that they are likely to get attacked by Iran, although Iran said it's going to attack US bases in the region. Those US bases in places like Qatar and elsewhere are very well protected by US air defense. So you can see actually that the Iranians might well decide to attack some of those states that traditionally support the Americans. So that is obviously a concern. Now, the future stability of Iran, I think, because it's such a closed society, and actually because the internet, as we know, it doesn't really work because it's all controlled by the Iranians. Our knowledge of what exactly is happening in Iran and what has been happening is pretty thin. So it's very difficult with the sort of snippets that we're getting coming out. Is what Iran would look like without Ayatollah Khomeini and without the Ayatollahs, and whether there is enough of an opposition that can have a use democratic in the widest possible meaning of it, whether there is enough to have a democratic the thought that one would go back, or Iran would go back to the sort of the time of the Shahs and all the rest of it, I think that is highly unlikely. However, it's very clear that the Iranian society, is a very well educated, and there are a lot of very significant people there who no doubt, could take up the mantle. But with such a repressive regime ruling for so long, with secret police and others so embedded in society, to break these regimes down is going to be a huge, huge challenge. And hopefully, President Trump is being circumspect about what he's going to do, because if this created a wider destabilization across the Middle East, as some like the Saudis are suggesting, for a short-term gain and for Trump to get a short-term, headline news, in the long term actually could be much worse. So let's hope that Trump is listening to people like the Saudis and others who probably understand the Middle East rather better than he does, and takes their advice rather than just going for some sort of news grabbing short, sharp hit that could make matters worse.
And sort of following on that, we were hearing from Iran saying that they're sort of at the peak of their readiness, and they've been claiming that they've been increasing their stockpile of missiles since the 12-day war that we saw last year between Iran and Israel. I mean, is there any evidence to support their claims? But I mean, as you mentioned as well, with just the lack of coverage we're getting at the moment, is it too hard to tell?
I think it's pretty hard. I think looking at two things, how could Iran, if Iran wanted to react to, say, a US strike, what could it do? Well, traditionally, it would have used its proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis, but they are much diminished and probably not in a position to do it. I mean, the Houthis could possibly launch some more sort of missile attacks on American shipping going through, the Red Sea or Straits of Hormuz, those sort of areas. But again, that is much diminished. Hezbollah really is not a terror organization that can do very much against the Americans these days, nor Hamas. And when it comes to missiles and weaponry, they might have got a few stocks. Of course, they've sold a heck of a lot to the Russians to get currency from them and also support from the Russians. And the missiles that we've seen hitherto, on several occasions, they fired missiles at Israel, and none of them got through. I mean, this is sort of second generation missile technology that the Iranians have against fourth and fifth generation US air defense. So it is difficult to see that Iran could really create any sort of major physical problems to US troops in the region, and really, it could sort of backfire on them, even more, because one could see how impotent that they would be for that. So the rhetoric coming out of Iran at the moment is what one would expect, because I think they absolutely don't want to have to react to a US strike, and people seeing them even weaker than that perhaps they were last year when the Americans struck their nuclear facilities.
It's now being reported that officials are saying that the reason why the US is reducing the number of personnel at that Qatar airbase is for precautionary measures. If we look at the US bases within the Middle East, what sort of precautionary actions do you think that the US is taking at the moment? And also, if Iran was to strike any of these bases, do they have key targets? How do you think they would act on this?
Well, certainly when the attacks were going on last year, Al Udeid US Air Base was a lot of staff were taken out. I understand less staff are being taken out at the moment, so that's perhaps a bit of an indicator. And these will be people who presumably are not directly involved in military activities in the airbase. Now, Al Udeid Air Base itself is very well protected with Patriot missiles and other air defense. And of course, fifth generation stealth fighters like the F-35s, which may well be used to attack Iran, but equally they could be used in an air defense role. When it comes to other US bases across the region, a lot of them, particularly say in Syria, which Iran might want to attack, these are special forces bases. Again, will be well protected. It is perhaps more likely that the Iranians may decide to sort of attack softer US facilities in the Middle East, maybe sort of embassies and those sort of areas, which will not naturally have this sort of type of air defense. However, these are much more point targets. What we've seen in the past is Iran fires drones and missiles in the general direction of where it wants to go, hoping they'll create damage. Now, Al Udeid Air Base is a huge air base, and they could fire a bunch of missiles at it, and some might hit. But to try and hit point targets like embassies, in various Arab states, I think is probably beyond what they could probably do. So I think all the cards are really in Trump's hands at the moment, and let's hope that he really listens. So we discussed before, listens to the advice he's getting from the Arab states before he does anything that will make anything worse. And what if he can prevent the execution of all these protesters that we anticipating, or certainly that's what the Iranians are telling us they're going to do, then that will be a good thing. But it will be balanced against really turning up the heat in the Middle East and destabilizing it more. Because actually, at the moment, the Middle East, although it might sound a little bit like an oxymoron, is pretty stable. The fact that the Iranian militias are much diminished, the fact the Iranian militias are no longer running Syria, the fact that Hamas have been much reduced, and the fact the Houthis in the south have been much reduced. Actually, the Middle East is fairly stable at the moment, and that is a good thing. So anything that Trump does, could actually turn that completely on its head. And let's hope that he's getting a lot of sage advice to make sure whatever he does will be more to the stability of the Middle East rather than the instability.
What sort of reaction can you expect from the international community, especially, if we look at last year, although different circumstances, you could say that the US strikes on Iran last year, they were met with contention in many ways. But then also, in terms of the US's allies at the moment, sort of NATO allies' reactions to Greenland as well. Do you think this puts Trump into a difficult position from an international perspective?
Unfortunately, I think Trump doesn't really concern himself about being in a difficult position for the rest of the planet. He seems to make decisions very much for himself and on a whim. And I think we're in a very different position now than we were last year. I think everybody, in a way, you could see why the Iranian nuclear program could have had a severe impact. So actually, by surgical strikes that were conducted, certainly, no doubt there were casualties of people who had nothing to do with the nuclear program, and I don't think anybody would celebrate that at all. But the fact that the Iranian nuclear program has been put back so far, that is a good thing. I think everybody can see what is happening in Iran, and the fact that 3,000 protesters have been killed by the state police. That is, I think, for most people in the world, most democratic people in the world, that is intolerable. So anything that can be done to stop that. That is a dilemma really facing, I think, President Trump at the moment. Now, there are two things I think that really hit me here. First of all, with Trump focusing on Iran, he's not focusing on Russia. And it sort of seems that the peace deal has sort of stumbled there. And of great concern to us in this country is what's happening, in Eastern Europe and the war there. Conversely, of course, if Trump is focusing his efforts on Iran, then he is not focusing on Greenland. Now, the Greenland issue, I think, to most of us is bonkers. Quite why President Trump thinks he should, subjugate Greenland or take over Greenland is, I think, to most people is not something one can explain at all, because it's inconsequential. This massive country with a few thousand people in it. During the Cold War, the Americans had maybe not hundreds of bases, but 40 or 50 military bases. They now have one. So why suddenly Greenland has become so important is really difficult for us to understand. And let's hope maybe it's part of Trump's greater sort of deal-making game that if he can turn away from that, then perhaps people will give him leeway elsewhere. But whatever happens, I think the basic fact is there are a lot of innocent people being executed or shot in the streets in Iran, and that is something that the world should not stand idly by and watch. And if Trump can stop that happening, then that will be a really good thing.
Well, Hamish, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Well, thanks very much for having me.